For millions of fans who grew up watching Roseanne, Sara Gilbert was more than just an actress. She was the brilliant, sarcastic, and deeply relatable Darlene Connor, the girl who spoke her mind and wasn't afraid to be different. Behind her sharp wit and quiet intelligence, audiences saw someone authentic, a rare kind of celebrity who didn't chase fame, but simply wanted to create something real. But what few realized was that while the world celebrated her as a rising star, Sara was silently battling pain, confusion, and emotional turmoil that would follow her for decades. Her success came early, her fame sudden, and her sense of self constantly tested. As she transitioned from a child star into adulthood, Sara faced a series of personal struggles that reshaped her life. From the pressures of Hollywood and public judgment to the heartbreak of relationships that crumbled under the spotlight, her journey became one of resilience rather than glamour. Even as she found new success as the creator and co-host of The Talk, Sara's calm composure masked deep emotional wounds, including the tragic loss of relationships and moments of isolation that few people ever knew about. Now, as she looks back on her decades-long career, Sara Gilbert's story reveals not only the tragedy of fame, but the price of being true to yourself in a world that demands perfection. What she endured behind the scenes makes her one of Hollywood's quietest, yet most heartbreaking figures. Sara Gilbert's story begins long before fame ever found her. Born into a family deeply rooted in the entertainment industry, her grandfather, Harry Crane, co-created The Honeymooners. It seemed inevitable that Sara would one day find her way to the screen. Yet, even as a young girl, she wasn't drawn to fame for the glamour or the attention. She was introspective, creative, and quietly ambitious. Acting wasn't just a dream. It was a way to express herself when words failed. Her big break came in 1988, when at just 13 years old, she landed the role of Darlene Connor on Roseanne. The show quickly became a cultural phenomenon, praised for its raw honesty and portrayal of working-class American life. Sara's sharp-tongued humor, paired with her ability to deliver heartfelt emotion, made Darlene one of the most beloved characters on television. But behind that sharp wit was a young girl quietly struggling to understand who she was in a world that expected her to fit into its mold. Fame came fast, and so did pressure. While audiences saw a confident and talented teen, Sara began to retreat into herself. Hollywood was demanding, and fame was isolating. Unlike many of her co-stars who embraced the spotlight, she preferred solitude. She was thoughtful, serious, and uncomfortable with the growing public attention. At school, classmates treated her differently, and on set, she felt the weight of being part of one of TV's biggest hits. It was also during these years that Sara began to experience deep internal conflict about her identity. While she excelled in her career, she wrestled privately with understanding her sexuality, something she wasn't ready to share with the world at that time. "I was very young," she once admitted in an interview, "and I didn't know how to process what I was feeling." The fear of judgment and rejection weighed heavily on her, especially in an era when Hollywood wasn't nearly as accepting as it is today. As Roseanne continued its run through the 1990s, Sara's fame grew, but so did her discomfort. She was praised for her maturity and intelligence, but she often felt disconnected from the life others thought she was living. Acting had become both a gift and a burden. She loved the craft but hated the attention that came with it. When Roseanne ended in 1997, Sara didn't chase new roles like most rising stars. Instead, she chose to step away, enrolling at Yale University to study art and photography. To outsiders, it seemed like a surprising move, a young actress walking away from guaranteed fame. But for Sara, it was a necessity. "I needed to find myself outside of television," she said. "I didn't want to lose who I was." Her time at Yale gave her the space she desperately needed, a place where she could be Sara, not Darlene. Yet even in this new environment, she often felt the loneliness that fame had left behind. She was no longer part of Hollywood's bright lights, but the scars of her early years in the spotlight lingered. By the time she returned to acting in the early 2000s, Sara had changed. She was wiser, more self-aware, and determined to control her own narrative. But the industry she returned to hadn't changed much, and neither had the challenges that came with being a woman who refused to play by Hollywood's superficial rules. Still, Sara pushed forward with quiet resilience. She took on smaller, meaningful projects, building a reputation not as a glamorous star, but as a serious artist. Yet beneath her calm and thoughtful demeanor, the pressures of her past never fully disappeared. The girl who once made millions laugh was still searching for peace, and a place in the world where she could finally be herself. When Sara Gilbert returned to Hollywood in the early 2000s, she did so on her own terms. No longer the teenage star from Roseanne, she wanted to be recognized for her intelligence, creativity, and authenticity. But as she began taking new roles, Sara quickly realized how much the industry had changed, and how much it hadn't. There was still pressure to look a certain way, act a certain way, and play the fame game. Yet Sara had no interest in pretending. She had grown more private, more introspective, and determined to define success for herself, not by Hollywood standards. While other stars chased headlines, Sara built her life around purpose. She took recurring roles in hit shows like The Big Bang Theory and ER, quietly reminding audiences of her talent. But it was behind the camera where her true strength emerged. In 2010, Sara created The Talk, a daytime show that allowed women to discuss current events, relationships, and life with honesty and vulnerability. It was a groundbreaking move, and for a while, it gave her a new sense of belonging. As an executive producer and co-host, Sara finally had a platform where she could be fully herself. She spoke candidly about motherhood, self-doubt, and her identity. She had come out publicly as gay years earlier, and The Talk became a space where she could use her experience to inspire others to live authentically. "For so long I tried to fit in," she once said, "but it turns out the only way to really belong is to be yourself." The show became an unexpected success, earning her respect as both a leader and a creator. For the first time, Sara felt like she had control over her career, her message, and her voice. Yet, even at the height of this success, her personal life began to show cracks that fame and fortune couldn't fix. In her private world, Sara was struggling to maintain balance. She was a devoted mother to her 3 children, but the demands of running a talk show, managing production, and navigating public scrutiny were overwhelming. Her relationship with musician Linda Perry, whom she married in 2014, started as a beautiful love story, filled with mutual admiration and creative energy. But over time, the pressures of fame and the challenges of 2 ambitious careers began to take their toll. Sara rarely spoke about the difficulties publicly, but those close to her described a woman caught between the need to nurture her family and the relentless demands of her professional life. "She tried to do it all," one insider revealed, "but sometimes even the strongest people break quietly." In 2019, after nearly 6 years of marriage, Sara filed for legal separation from Linda Perry. The news stunned fans who had admired their bond and seen them as one of Hollywood's most stable couples. But for Sara, the decision was deeply personal, not about failure, but about preservation. "Sometimes," she later reflected, "love changes form, but that doesn't mean it ends." Behind the scenes, Sara was also facing burnout. The endless cycle of production, criticism, and emotional labor had taken a toll on her spirit. While The Talk continued to thrive, Sara began withdrawing, often appearing subdued and distant on screen. By 2019, she announced she was leaving the show she had built from the ground up. Her departure was emotional, both for her co-hosts and the millions who had watched her journey from Roseanne to respected television producer. As she said her final goodbye on air, her voice trembled slightly. "It's hard to leave something you love, but sometimes change is necessary." It was a bittersweet moment that summed up Sara Gilbert's life, filled with courage but also quiet pain. She had spent decades giving the world her voice, yet deep down, she was still learning how to listen to her own heart. When the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Sara Gilbert finally had something she hadn't felt in years: quiet. But with that quiet came something else: the echo of everything she had pushed aside while trying to keep her career and personal life intact. For the first time since her teenage years, Sara was truly alone with herself. And that silence was both liberating and terrifying. Walking away from the talk in 2019 should have been a moment of peace, but it marked the beginning of a painful reckoning. For years, Sara had been the anchor of other people's stories, guiding conversations, supporting colleagues, managing conflicts. Yet she had never really confronted her own emotional exhaustion. The end of her marriage, the pressure of single parenthood, and the realization that she no longer knew who she was outside of work all collided at once. Close friends said she retreated from the public eye completely, focusing on her children and her mental health. She needed time to breathe again, one insider shared. Sara gave so much of herself to everyone, her family, her show, her audience, that there was nothing left for her. While fans speculated about her future in Hollywood, Sara was quietly battling depression and self-doubt. It wasn't the kind of struggle that made headlines, but it was real and consuming. She had spent her entire life in front of cameras, performing for an audience that adored her honesty, yet very few knew how deeply she hurt behind that honesty. Hollywood, in its relentless pursuit of the next big thing, quickly moved on. But Sara didn't chase relevance. Instead, she chose reflection. She began writing more, working behind the scenes, and dedicating her time to environmental and mental health causes, issues that had become deeply personal to her. During this period, Sara also reconnected with her Roseanne family for The Conners, the reboot of the beloved sitcom. It was supposed to be a triumphant return, but even that was clouded by controversy after the original Roseanne revival was canceled due to the scandal surrounding Roseanne Barr. As one of the executive producers, Sara had to make a painful choice to protect the legacy of the show by removing its namesake. It was a decision that carried emotional weight. "The show meant everything to me," Sara later admitted. But it wasn't just about nostalgia. It was about continuing a story that mattered. Her decision reflected the same quiet integrity that had defined her career, but it also deepened her sense of loss. What had once been a joyful family reunion became a reminder of how fragile everything in Hollywood could be. Behind the scenes, Sara continued to struggle with loneliness and the feeling that she had given so much of herself that there was little left to rebuild. She avoided red carpets, skipped award shows, and rarely gave interviews. Friends described her as introspective, still kind and funny, but often distant, like someone searching for peace in a world that refused to slow down. And yet, even in the midst of her pain, there was resilience. Sara found comfort in motherhood, in small routines, in simple things that fame could never offer: cooking for her kids, reading late at night, tending to her garden. It was in these quiet, everyday moments that she began to heal. "I've learned that life doesn't always give you closure," she once said in a rare conversation. "Sometimes it just gives you space, and that has to be enough." For someone who had spent a lifetime performing, that realization was profound. Sara didn't need to be the face of a movement or the star of a sitcom anymore. She just needed to be Sara, flawed, private, and finally free from the expectations that had haunted her since childhood. But the world hadn't heard the last of her. What came next would prove that even in tragedy, Sara Gilbert still had something powerful to say. In the years that followed her departure from the talk and the turbulence of her personal life, Sara Gilbert's public appearances became rare, yet her influence continued to ripple quietly across Hollywood. She had stepped out of the spotlight, but she was far from gone. Instead, Sara was finally living life on her own terms, not as a performer or producer, but as a woman who had learned to embrace imperfection and find peace in simplicity. For decades, she had been known as the witty, cynical Darlene Connor, a character whose sarcasm masked sensitivity, much like Sara herself. But beyond that iconic role, her true legacy had always been about something deeper. She had carved out a space in an industry that often punished authenticity, proving that you could be quiet and powerful, thoughtful and successful, vulnerable and strong. As she entered her 50s, Sara began focusing more on causes that reflected her inner growth. She became a passionate advocate for mental health awareness, LGBTQ+ equality, and environmental sustainability. She wasn't chasing fame anymore. She was using her platform for purpose. Her experiences with heartbreak, exhaustion, and identity had given her something far more meaningful than celebrity: empathy. Friends who knew her best described her transformation as peaceful but profound. "Sara doesn't need to be seen anymore," one longtime colleague said. "She just wants to make a difference, even if no one's watching." That quiet strength, that refusal to perform for the sake of attention, became the defining chapter of her story. Yet, despite her progress, the shadows of her past never fully disappeared. Sara has spoken about how fame at a young age left emotional scars, the loss of privacy, the constant scrutiny, and the struggle to separate who she was from who the world expected her to be. "When you grow up in front of millions of people," she once said, "you never really get to start fresh. Everyone already thinks they know you." In her later interviews, Sara began reflecting more deeply on the lessons she had learned. She spoke about motherhood with tenderness, calling her children her greatest teachers. She admitted that while her career had brought her success, it was family that brought her meaning. "They saved me," she said quietly. "They reminded me that I don't have to be perfect, just present." For fans who still remembered her as the young Darlene, these words struck a chord. Sara had gone from the sharp-tongued rebel on Roseanne to a symbol of quiet endurance, proof that strength doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes, it looks like simply surviving. Her story is tragic not because of failure, but because of the heavy price she paid for authenticity. Hollywood often celebrates the loudest voices and brightest stars, but Sara's journey reminds us that some of the most powerful stories belong to those who speak softly and live truthfully. Today, Sara Gilbert lives mostly out of the spotlight, focusing on writing, producing, and being a mother. She rarely grants interviews, and when she does, it's with the same thoughtful tone that has always defined her. There's no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance, a sense that every heartbreak, every loss, and every misstep shaped her into the person she was always meant to become. Her tragedy, in the end, isn't just sadness. It's the quiet beauty of a woman who faced the pain of fame, love and self-discovery, and still found a way to stand tall. Sara once said, "The hardest part of growing up in public is that everyone sees you fall. But if you're lucky, they also see you get back up." And that is exactly what makes her story so deeply human. In her silence, there's wisdom. In her pain, there's grace. And in her journey, there's hope. A reminder that even the softest voices can leave the loudest echoes.